Whether you're a diehard fan or just stumbled into this web-slinging, villain-packed universe, one thing is clear: the spectacular Spider-Man is on another level when it comes to animated adaptations of our friendly neighborhood hero. Sure, it doesn't have that blockbuster vibe that needs to cram everything into a 2.5-hour runtime, but that's exactly where the show shines. With an impeccable narrative flow and the creative freedom that only animation allows, this series delivers something special. And yes, the humor is top tier. From fourth-wall breaking quips to clever nods to iconic villains, the show is packed with references that make the story even richer. Not to mention, we get the classic chaos of Peter Parker's teenage life in full force. But don't be fooled, this isn't just a comedy. There are high-stakes moments, intense fights, and a well-crafted story that gives weight to every punch thrown. Before we dive deep into the story, from sand monsters to giant lizards and crazy goblins, let's take a moment to see what makes all of this happen. So buckle up, because in this video, we're going through the entire story of the spectacular Spider-Man from start to finish. Peter Parker is your average 16-year-old, except for the part where he fights crime in a pretty decent spider costume. Unlike some heroes who technically don't kill villains but leave them in the ICU for years, Peter follows a strict moral code. As with almost every Spider-Man adaptation, we see the usual struggles. No uncle, no money. Yes, Peter is broke, unlike certain rich orphans we won't name. He gets bullied. His best friend also gets bullied. He has a friend named Gwen, who for now is just a friend. And of course, there's a love interest who barely matters to the plot. Your standard cheerleader archetype. Oh, and yes, she rejects him. Despite all this, Peter is a brilliant student, and as a reward, he lands an unpaid internship at Dr. Connor's lab. Joining him is Gwen and Eddie Brock, a childhood friend who will become very important later. But no spoilers just yet.
Are you serious right now, bro?
Now, let's meet some of the other key players. There's J. Jonah Jameson, the editor-in-chief of the Daily Bugle, a newspaper seemingly dedicated to exposing masked heroes while passionately advocating for the civil rights of supervillains. And honestly, this version of Jameson is more unhinged than ever. Then we have Norman Osborn, a wealthy scientist and father to Peter's best friend, Harry. Aunt May, Peter's caring guardian. Flash, the school's biggest bully, but also Spider-Man's #1 fan. Liz, Flash's airheaded girlfriend, and plenty of others we'll meet along the way. At Dr. Connor's lab, we also get introduced to Max, a pretty normal guy until he gets electrocuted and takes an unexpected bath. Not a regular bath, though. This one involved a tank full of electric eels, which instead of killing him, turned him into a walking, sparking powerhouse. At first, Max doesn't want to be a villain, but after causing some accidental destruction in the city, he goes to Dr. Connors for help. Unfortunately for him, Spider-Man shows up first, and, well, let's just say Batman would approve of Spidey's hit first, ask questions later approach. Meanwhile, Peter's personal life is in shambles. He's broke, gets clowned on at school, but at least Gwen is there to stand up for him. At the lab, things take a turn when Dr. Connors uses a lizard-based formula to regrow his missing arm. Everyone is amazed, thinking it could be a breakthrough for humanity, maybe even a Nobel Prize. But Dr. Connors didn't exactly read the fine print on the side effects. Instead of an award, he ends up with a really cool lizard skin. And because lizards aren't exactly known for their rational thinking, he immediately goes on a rampage. Enter Peter, who, with his agility and quick thinking, dodges every attack. The fights in this show? Absolutely top tier. The battle escalates all the way to a lake, where Eddie, our soon-to-be important character, helps Spider-Man administer the cure, turning Connors back to normal. The downside? He loses his newly regrown arm in the process. But while all this was happening, Peter also took photos to land a job at the Daily Bugle, because, you know, rent isn't going to pay itself. This, of course, annoys his lab partners, who think he was just exploiting the situation instead of actually helping. Little do they know, he was the one getting punched in the face to save them. Because let's be real, Peter Parker's life is just one long series of unfortunate events. He lost his uncle, almost lost his aunt to a villain boyfriend. Wait, no, that's from the movies. Feeling worthless, Peter even considers taking an antidote to get rid of his powers. But after seeing a photo of Uncle Ben, he decides against it. Because after all, he's just a 16-year-old kid, but with way too many responsibilities. The next day, Peter heads to Harry's place to help him out. Here, we see just how bad Norman Osborn's parenting is. He constantly belittles his son, and while Peter tries to support him, there's only so much he can do. Spider-Man is a busy hero. It's not his job to fix teenage trauma. It's his job to cause trauma for insane villains. Harry, unaware that Peter is Spider-Man, gets frustrated whenever Peter abandons him. Meanwhile, Norman Osborn isn't exactly a supervillain just yet, but he is an unethical businessman, doing whatever it takes to make money. For now, he's just stealing inventions, until he strikes a deal with a certain crime lord. And let's be honest, No good guy would do that. The deal? To create supervillains? The Kingpin operates like a chess master, staying behind the scenes while sending his pawns to fight Peter. But for now, that doesn't matter much. At school, Harry and Peter make up and decide to try out for the football team. Why does this matter? Well, it doesn't really, but it's worth noting how well this series balances Peter's personal life with his hero duties. It's masterful. At the end of the day, he's still just a teenager. Both of them perform well at tryouts, but there's only one spot for a starter and one for a substitute. The coach picks Peter as the starter. Harry, already rich and privileged, feels overshadowed. He tells Peter he didn't need to win this too, exposing his insecurities. The guy has everything, yet all he wants is to be Peter. If only he knew what Peter actually goes through.
I need that money.
Meanwhile, Kingpin and Norman's first villain experiment is a success. A thug, after being exposed to an experimental machine, turns into Sandman in a brutal, borderline horror scene. Of course, he goes after Peter, and once again, the fight scenes in this show, absolutely phenomenal. Sandman's ability to shift his form makes Spidey's strength and agility useless at first. He takes a serious beating before figuring out a way to trap him in fresh cement, temporarily neutralizing him. After this, Peter feels guilty for using his powers to win the football tryout, so he gives up his spot in favor of Harry. Meanwhile, back at Pinky and the Brain, Norman and Kingpin, their villain experiments continue. And their next creation? Rhino, easily one of the weirdest of the bunch. Anyway, he hears that Peter takes pictures of Spider-Man and goes to the Daily Bugle looking for information. And here we see that, despite being completely unhinged, J. Jonah Jameson isn't actually evil. He even helps Peter escape while pretending not to know him. Peter hides, and that's when Spider-Man swings into action. He saves Jameson and then faces off against Rhino, who's incredibly strong but also incredibly slow. His punches are useless against Peter's mix of speed and strength. But in the end, Rhino isn't beaten with brute force. He goes down due to dehydration. Peter, as always, plays it smart, taking advantage of the fact that Rhino's nearly indestructible armor also traps heat and prevents water from getting in. It's a great example of how this show isn't just about throwing punches to solve problems. After defeating Rhino, Spidey finally gets some info on the Kingpin. Well, at least his last name. While digging deeper, he crosses paths with a guy named Tombstone, who delivers a solid punch to Spidey and tells him that as long as he keeps taking out bad guys, more will keep coming. If Peter really wants to put an end to crime, he should join them instead. Of course, Spider-Man's good sense kicks in, and despite being broke, he turns the offer down. Then the cops show up and try to arrest Spidey for trespassing. He escapes, but this moment sparks the whole police debate, hero or menace. Meanwhile, Peter Parker's life isn't going so well either. The school dance is coming up, and his date? Well, he doesn't have one. First, he considers asking Betty, the receptionist at the Daily Bugle, but he keeps second-guessing himself. To make things worse, Aunt May steps in and casually reminds him that Betty is too old for him. Ouch. Meanwhile, Gwen is actually hoping Peter will ask her. But of course, Peter is as oblivious as ever. He sees her as just a friend. But don't worry, Aunt May comes in clutch and sets him up with none other than Mary Jane. At the dance, things seem to be going great. Gwen ends up going with Eddie, and everyone finds a date. But the second Peter walks in with Mary Jane, Harry gets a little jealous, and Gwen gets pretty bummed out. Long story short, no one can believe that Peter actually managed to bring someone like Mary Jane to the dance. As the party goes on, Harry's frustration only grows when the girl he brought decides to get back with her ex. So, in classic bad decision fashion, he runs off and downs a mystery serum from Oscorp. Because, you know, that always ends well. Meanwhile, someone else makes their grand entrance. The Green Goblin. He teams up with some crooks and crashes a fancy party searching for the Kingpin. And let's be real, this version of the Green Goblin? Absolutely amazing. Conveniently, Jameson is also at the party. He calls the cops and of course tells Peter to get down there and take some pictures. Unfortunately, Peter doesn't even get a goodbye kiss before he ditches Mary Jane to throw hands with the Goblin. Their fight is wild. Both of them rely on mobility, using everything around them to land blows. Spidey manages to pin the Goblin down, but before he can unmask him, the Goblin throws a bomb into the party. Spidey has to act fast and get rid of it. In the end, things turn out okay. Peter even makes it back to the dance and gets a chance to dance with Mary Jane. The next day, Spider-Man is back on crime-fighting duty, throwing in classic movie references as he goes. Meanwhile, in Peter's personal life, well, he gets ahead of himself. He tries to make a move on Mary Jane, only for her to remind him that they just went to the dance as friends. Ouch. But someone else takes this opportunity to get closer to Peter, a cheerleader. And in case you forgot, she's dating Flash. So place your bets. Will Peter end up with Mary Jane or the cheerleader? Meanwhile, over at Oscorp, we meet Dr. Octavius. He works for Norman Osborn, but while running an experiment, the Green Goblin sabotages him. The machine activates at the wrong time, and, well, let's just say Octavius doesn't walk away from it the same. Now, furious and unstable, he turns against Norman for treating him like trash. Spidey tries to step in, but Octavius is just too fast. Unfortunately, the battle doesn't really go anywhere, for now. The next day, Gwen finds Harry lying on the ground and something seems seriously off. Later, Harry starts showing signs of being way stronger than before. Gwen, being a good friend, tells Peter that Harry is clearly on something. Peter, being Peter, brushes it off. Why? Because he's too busy trying to get with the cheerleader. Classic Parker. The problem is that the one causing trouble again is none other than Dr. Octopus, who's after a powerful energy source. But Spidey isn't about to let that slide. He goes after him, outmaneuvers his mechanical arms, the only real threat in this fight, and takes him down. In the end, Spider-Man wins. Meanwhile, in the high school drama department, Flash Thompson breaks up with the head cheerleader, and guess who everyone blames for it? That's right, Peter Parker. At the same time, Harry is still chugging that green serum, and let's just say he's not looking too great. But for now, that's not the biggest problem. Two things take priority. First, the Green Goblin is out terrorizing people and stealing from Oscorp. So if Norman Osborn isn't the Goblin, then who is? Second, there's a costume party at school, and Peter, because why not, shows up dressed as Spider-Man. The cheerleader casually tells him he can web her up anytime. And yes, folks, Peter is becoming a ladies' man. But the fun doesn't last long because guess who crashes the party? That's right, the Psycho in Green, the Green Goblin. Spidey goes after him, leading to one of the best fights in the series. The battle takes them inside a factory, where the Goblin starts blowing everything up. As always, Spidey has to rely on his agility to survive the chaos. At one point, the Goblin traps Peter and throws him off a high ledge. Thinking fast, Spider-Man cocoons himself in webbing to cushion the fall, and honestly, I can't see any live-action Spider-Man pulling this off. It just works so much better in animation. The Goblin escapes, and Spidey suspects Norman might be behind the mask, considering he's using Oscorp's tech, so he sneaks into the Osborn mansion, only to find out the shocking truth. The Green Goblin is actually Harry, but here's the twist. Harry himself doesn't even realize it. The green serum he's been taking is addictive, enhances strength, and most importantly, messes with his mind. It creates a split personality, making him lose control over himself at times. Spidey promises Norman he won't expose Harry, and in return, Norman swears he'll do whatever it takes to help his son. In the next episode, NASA discovers an alien life form in space and sends it to Dr. Connor's lab for research. Peter isn't exactly allowed inside, but of course, that's not stopping him from sneaking in to check it out. But he's not the only one with an interest in this new discovery. Someone else is planning to do more than just look. Enter Black Cat. The problem? During their little scuffle, the symbiote escapes and latches onto Peter's foot. Black Cat bails, and Peter doesn't even realize that something is seriously off. Soon enough, he starts noticing changes. He's faster, stronger, and feeling better than ever. But instead of returning the alien sample, he decides to keep it. And that, my friends, is where things start to spiral. Meanwhile, some fraud is running around in a fake Spider-Man suit using cheap tricks to rob banks. But then Peter, now powered up with the symbiote, steps in. And let's just say, the fight isn't even fair. Spidey absolutely demolishes the imposter. With some unexpected help from Black Cat, who uses the chaos as a distraction to snatch a few jewels, we find out that the fake Spider-Man was actually Chameleon in disguise. But honestly, that doesn't even matter. What does? Spider-Man kissing Black Cat. Now that's a moment to remember.
Yeah, boy.
Things keep escalating, and one day several villains who were previously locked up by Spider-Man break out of prison and team up. Meanwhile, in Peter Parker's personal life, Eddie is fuming. To him, Peter is nothing but an opportunist. But for now, that doesn't matter much, because all those villains are coming straight for Spider-Man. Peter gears up, knowing things are about to get intense. With so many enemies coming at him at once, Peter's agility only helps him dodge attacks, and even then, he still gets hit by a few projectiles. The symbiote's power is also limited since he's not entirely used to it yet. But he fights smart. Just when he thinks he's gaining the upper hand, Sandman, one of his toughest opponents, sneaks up from behind and slams him away. Rhino jumps in, attacking Peter in open ground to keep him from blacking out due to the extreme heat. But that's just a distraction. Two other villains hit him with their powers. Spider-Man, however, is too fast. He dodges in a split second, leaps onto the back of a flying villain, and takes them down for good. Finally, with a perfectly timed strike, he defeats Dr. Octopus. This fight is absolutely insane. Without the symbiote, Spidey might not have stood a chance. But in the end, he pulls off one of the best battles in the entire show. Everyone is stunned by how he managed to defeat so many villains on his own. But while Spider-Man is holding up just fine, Peter Parker's life is falling apart. Aunt May starts feeling unwell and suffers a heart attack. Meanwhile, Eddie's hatred for Peter only grows stronger. Thankfully, Aunt May survives, but the hospital bill? It's ridiculously expensive, way beyond what they can afford. With his head full of problems, Peter goes to school, but the symbiote makes his personality even worse. Instead of accepting support from his friends, he pushes everyone away. Desperate, he turns to one of Kingpin's henchmen, looking for money. The thug tells him that if he wants in, he'll have to prove himself by staying out of crime fighting for a whole week, and Peter accepts. Meanwhile, Eddie loses his job at Dr. Connors' lab due to the symbiote's disappearance. This only fuels his rage toward Peter. But this time, Peter doesn't just take it. He lifts Eddie up with one hand and tells him he's sick of his whining. After dealing with all this mess, Peter finally realizes he's turning into a total jerk. He blames the suit and fights to take it off. But the symbiote is deep in his mind now, messing with him through visions of Uncle Ben and its own manipulative whispers. It's like watching a psychological battle, Peter's subconscious versus the symbiote, deciding his fate. The symbiote keeps trying to convince him to stay, but the memory of Uncle Ben won't let it happen. It's an incredible internal conflict, and in the end, Peter's goodness wins. He rips the symbiote off and says goodbye to it for good. But there's a problem. That black goo finds its way to Eddie. Through their connection, Eddie learns Peter is Spider-Man, and now his hatred reaches a whole new level. To him, Peter took everything from him, even the symbiote. Now bonded with the symbiote, Eddie decides it's time for revenge. Meanwhile, Peter regains his sanity, confronts Kingpin's henchmen, and backs out of their deal. He also makes amends with his friends, especially Gwen, who's clearly thrilled to see him back to normal. And just like that, life seems to return to normal. That is, until Venom attacks Spider-Man for the first time. The symbiote enhances Eddie's strength massively, making him more than a match for Spider-Man. One punch sends Peter flying. And let's be honest, Venom's design in this show? Absolutely top tier. Venom tells Peter he hasn't suffered enough. Finishing him off now would be too easy, so instead, he goes after everyone Peter loves: Aunt May, Gwen, and more. One thing this version does incredibly well is its take on Peter and Eddie's relationship. They were childhood friends. Their parents died in the same plane crash, but Peter had Uncle Ben and Aunt May to raise him, while Eddie had no one. To him, the symbiote feels like the only friend he ever had. That's what makes him such a layered villain. Then, the fight begins. And guess what? Spidey, like an absolute idiot, asks the symbiote to take him back. And the symbiote agrees. It abandons Eddie, ready to bond with Peter again. But this time, Peter refuses. He traps it instead. With the symbiote sealed away under a construction site, the threat is neutralized. Back in Peter's life, Aunt May recovers, and everything seems to be going well. Oh, and guess what? Gwen kisses Peter. 10-10 move from Gwen. But Peter, absolute 0 points for not realizing she likes him sooner. The problem is, after that kiss, Peter and Gwen just stare at each other awkwardly. Peter, being Peter, is too shy to make a move, which gives Flash Thompson's ex, the cheerleader, the perfect opportunity to swoop in and make a move on Peter. Meanwhile, another villain is terrorizing the city, Mysterio. He shows up acting like some all-powerful magician and actually defeats Spider-Man in their first fight on a bridge. But in their second encounter, Peter figures out it's all just illusions and beats Mysterio using his spider sense. And honestly, it's a sick moment. Like, Mysterio sends a tiger at him, but Peter doesn't even flinch, because his spider sense helps him distinguish what's real and what's fake. And with that, Mysterio goes down. Then, another villain enters the scene, Kraven, a ridiculously strong Russian hunter who's after Spider-Man, dead or alive. He nearly lands an arrow on Peter, but thanks to the spider sense, Peter dodges in time. Turns out Kraven just wants to fight someone worthy. And honestly, that's a solid motivation. They battle on a rooftop, but Kraven isn't fast enough to land a hit. He loses and gets webbed up, admitting he's lost his honor. Determined to redeem himself, he seeks out a scientist who injects him with a serum, turning him into a half-lion hybrid. He goes after Spider-Man again, but even with his new big cat upgrade, he still can't match Peter's speed and strength. Imagine if he had fought Peter with the symbiote, he'd be heading straight to the grave. Kraven loses again and disappears. Days later, a mysterious mastermind gathers several of Spidey's old villains to hunt him down. With no symbiote-enhanced power, Peter has to rely entirely on strategy, like exhausting Rhino until he collapses and freezing Sandman solid. By the end, the villains fail, and Spider-Man once again outsmarts them all. Then comes the big reveal. The mastermind is none other than Dr. Octopus. His goal? Typical villain stuff. taking over the world. Spider-Man, of course, stops him, breaking up the villain coalition in the process. And let's be real, he's the only hero in this city dealing with this many villains. It's only a matter of time before he won't be able to handle them all. Meanwhile, Peter finds himself caught in a love triangle. He's torn between Gwen and the cheerleader. I'm Team Gwen, by the way. Poor girl spends most of the series getting ignored. And in the end, the cheerleader wins. She makes the first move, and the whole school starts gossiping. Meanwhile, Harry Osborn returns and starts pursuing Gwen. Eventually, he wins her over, and they start dating. And guess what? Peter gets jealous. Well, Peter, that's what you get for making the wrong choice and betting on something uncertain when you had a much better option right next to you. But for now, that doesn't matter because another character who had been missing finally makes a comeback. Eddie. And what does he find? The exact place where Spider-Man hid the symbiote. So he digs through the foundation of a building and, surprise, surprise, Venom is back. Meanwhile, J.J. Jameson's astronaut son gets some weird powers. At first, it seems like a good thing, he's actually helping people, but soon enough, he starts losing his mind. Spider-Man eventually takes him down with a massive electric shock, and here's where we get a glimpse of why J.J. hates Spider-Man so much. He doesn't see him as a real hero. He thinks real heroes are the police, doctors, and of course, astronauts like his son. But after that huge electrical shock, his son completely loses his sanity. Ironically, that's exactly what should have happened to the guy with the actual electricity-based powers. Just another reason for Jameson to hold an even bigger grudge against Spidey. Venom, ever the opportunist, uses this situation to reveal Peter's identity to Jameson. Now, this is a disaster for Peter. His secret identity is what keeps him and his loved ones safe from villains, and also keeps him from facing legal trouble for his vigilante activities, unless of course he had a fortune like certain other heroes who can buy their way out of problems. But Peter, he has to fight tooth and nail to keep his secret. Now everyone starts looking into Peter and the people around him. At one point, while running from reporters, Peter hides with Gwen. They almost have a moment, but of course they're interrupted by the sound of a ringing phone. It's Harry, the king of bad timing. And just like that, Team Gwen still has a shot. It's also becoming very clear that Peter just wants to swing his web at everybody. You know what I mean? Moving on, Venom goes all out trying to prove that Peter is Spider-Man. He even rips his mask off in front of a bunch of reporters, but Peter manages to escape unnoticed. Once again, Spidey defeats Venom using an antidote, Eddie loses the symbiote, and he ends up in a psychiatric facility. Peter Parker is officially cleared of being Spider-Man. Time passes, and the story keeps unfolding. At some point, Flash finds out that Harry has been using some sort of performance-enhancing drug for his sports achievements and exposes him. And, as expected, once everyone learns about it, their championship titles feel meaningless. Because, well, cheating ruins the whole point of competition. Harry is devastated when his classmates start treating him differently. He spirals and begins considering taking the Green Goblin serum again. Meanwhile, in Peter's personal life, the cheerleader gets mad at him for sneaking glances at Gwen. But they kind of work things out, going back and forth in this will they won't they situation. However, since this is a video about the series' storyline and not about who Peter wants to web up, let's stay focused. But if he had to pick, it should definitely be Gwen. The next day, the Green Goblin shows up, threatening people left and right and taking over the crime scene, because apparently the real Kingpin isn't going to make an appearance in this series. The Goblin captures the cheerleader's brother and turns him into another supervillain, this time one with fire-based powers. Luckily, the guy, known as Molten Man, isn't actually evil. He doesn't want to fight Spider-Man, at least not at first. But the Green Goblin forces his hand, leading to an intense showdown. In the end, Rain weakens him, and Spider-Man defeats him. He gets locked up, leaving the cheerleader heartbroken. The story keeps escalating. Norman Osborn, for some mysterious reason, invites Spider-Man to test the security of a prison for supervillains. That's already suspicious enough, but as expected, things go south. Spidey manages to escape the prison, only to find himself in another section filled with villains he previously captured. The Goblin takes this chance to sabotage everything, releasing all the criminals so Spider-Man has to take them all on at once. Meanwhile, Black Cat sneaks into the prison to free her father, but since she's already inside, she decides to help Spider-Man take down the bad guys and escape. And here's the kicker. Her father is none other than the man who killed Uncle Ben. Even though he acknowledges his past mistakes, he chooses to stay in prison to serve his sentence. That's a powerful moment. Taking responsibility like that is rare. But for Peter, facing the man who changed his life forever is a heavy burden. He makes it clear there's no forgiveness, no making things right. Black Cat, however, isn't happy with this. She turns against Spider-Man. But honestly, what's one more enemy on Peter's already massive list? Meanwhile, at school, there's a play happening, and Peter had promised the cheerleader he'd be there. Spoiler alert, he doesn't show up. Not that he could have anyway. She's upset, but for now, she lets it slide. The next day, Harry Osborn shows up at Gwen's house looking for help. She calls Peter over, and Harry reveals that he wasn't missing because he was acting as the Green Goblin. No, someone in a goblin suit had actually kidnapped him. And now we have a mystery. Who is the real Green Goblin? Is it Harry, or is it someone else? The truth will only come out as the episodes progress. After this reveal, Harry heads home, and left alone with Gwen, Peter finally makes his move. He confesses his feelings for her, but says he understands if she doesn't feel the same way. But she does. She's been in love with him since 7th grade. Peter is over the moon. They finally kiss. This is cinema. Team Gwen is winning. But, plot twist. Gwen pulls away. She can't do this behind Harry's back, or behind the cheerleader's back. In the end, she agrees, but only if they both end their current relationships first. And knowing Peter, if given the chance, he'd go after Mary Jane, Black Cat, the cheerleader, and maybe even his teacher. But hey, a real man owns up to his commitments, right? The problem? Harry overhears everything, and his expression says it all. He's ready for revenge. Then the show expertly builds up the mystery of who the real goblin is. Both Norman and Harry seem suspicious, but if I had to bet, it's Norman. Spider-Man investigates, and in the end, the truth comes out. Norman Osborn is the real Green Goblin. He set up his own son to take the fall so no one would suspect him. And so, the final battle begins. The Goblin uses all his gadgets to try and take Spider-Man down, but nothing works. In the end, Spider-Man kills Norman. At least, that's what everyone believes. But Norman is actually alive and in hiding. With that, the episode ends. Harry truly believes Spider-Man murdered his father. Peter breaks up with the cheerleader, sending her into a depression. And Gwen, unable to leave Harry so soon after his father's death, stays with him. The Spectacular Spider-Man is widely regarded as the best animated version of Spidey. It was incredibly successful, but due to legal issues between Disney, Marvel, and Sony, it was canceled before getting a proper ending. And that's a shame. This show deserved a real conclusion. Who knows? X-Men made a comeback. Maybe one day this show will too.